Now, this course section is an optional one. This course section will be a refresher on React.js, and you can skip it if you already have a solid React.js foundation, for example, because you took my React the Complete Guide course. In this module, I'm going to make sure we're all on the same page by again exploring what exactly React is and why we use it, by diving into some core React concepts, components, props, and state. And we're going to build a full project and explore some advanced concepts like effects and context. Now, we're going to use functional components only here. We're going to use React hooks, and you're going to learn what that is in this module. And we're going to use these concepts throughout the rest of this course. So don't skip this module if you don't know these concepts yet, or if you're not sure about them, if it's been some time since you last worked with React, but absolutely do feel free to skip this module if you do know these concepts, because you won't learn anything about Next.js here. It's really just about React. And we're going to start with Next.js and its core concepts in the section after this section. So let's dive right into this video and this topic by answering the most important question first. What exactly is React.js and why would we use it? Why do we need it? What's the problem it helps us solve? Regarding the what, we can of course visit react.js.org, the official webpage of React.js. And there we learn that React is a JavaScript library, and it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Now that's quite straightforward. It's a library for the JavaScript programming language that helps us build user interfaces. But what exactly does this nice sentence mean? React.js is a library, and to be precise, it's a client-side library. It's about client-side JavaScript. So the JavaScript code which runs in the browsers of your visitors. And that is important because we use JavaScript in the browser to manipulate web pages after they were loaded. And that allows us to build rich, highly interactive, modern user interfaces for our websites. Take something like Netflix, for example, which is actually built with React. There we can browse around, we can hover over one of the movies or series, and we get more details there. We can add it to our list, and we can go to that list page, and everything here happens very smoothly and also quickly. We never need to click anywhere and load a new HTML page. That refresh icon in the top left corner never spins. Because we never request a new HTML page, we never have to wait for a new HTML page to be generated by the server. And that happens because JavaScript is doing some work here, and it's updating what we see on the screen, the DOM, whilst we are working on that page. And that gives us that nice user experience, that nice UI, which we know from mobile apps, for example. When we work with a mobile app, we're used to things being very reactive. There we can work with the app and switch between different screens without having that latency, which we know from some websites, without requesting new HTML pages behind the scenes. So mobile apps therefore feel very reactive. Things happen instantly. We don't need to wait for new pages to load or for actions to start. And traditionally, in web apps, that was different. There we often had to click a button and then wait for a new page to be loaded and to show up. And whilst that, of course, also does work, it is not the same user experience our users know from their mobile apps, and it's often not the user experience we want to deliver, therefore. Now, that's a problem we can solve with JavaScript in the browser, because that allows us to manipulate the DOM and therefore what the user sees without requesting a new HTML page and waiting for it. And therefore, just JavaScript would be enough. But let me give you an example of just JavaScript and why we might want to use something like React instead of just JavaScript. This is a very simple demo here. I have some content on the page, and when I click delete, I get this overlay where I can confirm or cancel. Now, both buttons don't do anything but close that overlay, as does clicking that backdrop. But what you see on this page here, or what happens when we click delete, all of that is controlled with JavaScript. I got a HTML file with some very basic HTML content, some styling, which we can ignore, and then the magic happens in this app.js file. In there, I got some code that in the end adds a listener to this main button which we got on the screen, so to this delete button here. And when that button is clicked, I fire this show modal handler function, and in there we run a bunch of JavaScript code to create various elements, divs, paragraphs, and then the cancel and confirm buttons to configure those elements and add text or CSS classes, and to add event listeners to those elements as well, to then fire that close modal handler function, which in the end removes the overlay, this modal as we call it. And then still in the show modal handler function, I got some code that combines all those created elements and brings them onto the screen. This is the JavaScript code responsible for opening this overlay here. Now it works and it's not too bad, but it's quite some code for this simple action. And here we only got one to-do in this demo application. If we would add multiple to-dos, if we would repeat this HTML code multiple times to render more to-dos on the page, or to even render those to-dos dynamically after fetching them from a database, for example, this code would become far more difficult, far more complex. For example, I couldn't just select a button on the page with that query selector, because we would have multiple delete buttons for multiple to-dos, and we would have to make sure that for different to-dos, different overlays are opened, and when we confirm the deletion, the correct to-do is deleted. We're not even doing that here in this demo, but that would be more complexity which we have to add and handle if we build a more realistic app here, a more realistic website. And therefore, just JavaScript works and can sometimes be a good choice, but it can also reach its limits. And one of the reasons is that with just JavaScript, you have to write every single step that should be taken. We want to create an element. We want to set its content. We want to add classes. We want to add a click listener. Then what should happen on that click listener? Every single step needs to be described. This way of programming and bringing something onto the screen is called an imperative approach. We simply describe action after action, step after step. And that can reach its limits. And in addition, even if we don't reach any limits, we as a developer have to take care about all the nitty-gritty details. We have to run the low-level code for creating a button, for setting its text content. And therefore, in the end, we reinvent the wheel over and over again, doing repetitive tasks. Now here's the same example with React. This works in exactly the same way, but the code looks very different. I got a React project here, and as a side note, you find both code repositories, both code snapshots attached. And here in React.js, this might look a bit more complex. We got more files involved here, but that's something we're going to learn throughout the course, why we have multiple files. But in the end, this is the main code that's responsible for bringing this to-do onto the screen. And what's very interesting here is that we have like a custom HTML component here, a custom HTML element. And indeed, React is all about those components. React is all about splitting your application into small building blocks, small components, where every building block, every component has a clear task, And therefore, your code stays maintainable and manageable, and React, the library, will do the heavy lifting of rendering something on the screen and of combining all your code. So for example, if we look into the code for this custom element which we built here, which lives in this to-do.js file, then we here again see that I have some HTML code for rendering a to-do, but that we have some kind of placeholder in here, and then some kind of other code which we don't fully understand yet, but which we will understand and learn about throughout this course. And in the end, that's the code responsible for rendering such a to-do, and for rendering the modal, this overlay here, as well, and for rendering it conditionally. And what's interesting here is that even though we don't understand this code yet, and even though it's certainly strange that we have HTML code in JavaScript files, even though that's all weird, we can definitely see that we don't have a bunch of step-by-step instructions here. Instead, we kind of define what we want to have as an end result, and then we have some placeholders, some flexible elements there, and then we have very simple instructions here, which in the end then will be processed by React to change what's visible on the screen. And all these low-level instructions for creating elements and setting text content and so on, those instructions are not written by us when using React. Instead, they will be written or defined, if you want to call it like this, by the React library. We as a React developer work on a higher level, which makes working with React and which makes building complex user interfaces way easier. And that is why we want to use React.js. It makes building modern, rich, complex user interfaces easier, and it does so by giving us a higher level syntax where we write code in a declarative way, in a declarative component focused way. We define what we want to have on the screen, what the end goal is. We create these custom HTML elements, and React will do the rest. And one side effect, for example, is that if we wanted more than one to do, we could just copy that custom element, change maybe that text, that configuration, and boom, we got a second to do here. And we got a button on that to do which works as well. And that is why we use technologies or frameworks like React. Now, because things get easier with React, and because we can build those rich user interfaces with React and JavaScript, when working with React, we often build so-called single-page applications. Because whilst we can use React to control parts of a HTML page, let's say some interactive sidebar, and therefore we add a widget, you could say, to a page where only a part of the page is controlled with React, it is more common to control the entire page with React, which means that we use React for everything we see on the screen and even for switching pages. So when we click on a link and we load a new page, as I did with Netflix when I clicked on my list, it looks to the user as if we switched the page, but we actually don't request a new HTML file from some server. Instead, we just used JavaScript through React.js to change what's visible on the screen. And that often leads to a smoother UI and a better user experience, as you see it at the example of Netflix. It's built with React, and there we never request a second HTML page. Hence, it's a single-page application where, after the initial request to the site, React takes over and controls what we see on the screen. Now, throughout this course, we are going to learn React in depth, and we're going to start with this basic dummy demo here to learn about some core concepts. And then later throughout the course, we're going to build this meetup project, this mini project here, where we see more React features in action and where we can practice all those basics and where we then at the end really understand how React works and which features it brings. Now, this course is about React, but it is worth noting that there are alternatives to React.js. Now we're going to focus on React here, and React is one of the most popular front-end frameworks or libraries, however you want to call it, you can learn. It's a lean and focused component-based UI library. It really focuses on this component thing, and it doesn't have a lot of other features built in. If you need other features like routing, which we are going to learn about in this video, then you need to bring extra third-party packages. That's not horrible, but it is something to be aware of. React itself is really just focused on bringing stuff onto the screen and updating that for you and allowing you to build these custom HTML elements, these components. That's the core focus of React. Now, an alternative to React, which has more built-in features, would be Angular, another very important and very popular front-end framework. And I got a course on this as well. Angular is a complete component-based UI framework, so it also focuses on components, just like React, but it ships more built-in features than React. It also embraces TypeScript right from the start. And it can be overkill for smaller projects, therefore, since it has way more features built in. But for large projects, on the other hand, you don't need to rely on the community as much, because there's more built into that framework. So that's simply a little consideration you have to make. The syntax also looks a bit differently because whilst it is component focused, building these components works a bit differently with Angular than it does with React. Again, I got a course on that if you want to check out Angular as well. And we also have another very popular framework, another popular alternative, and that would be Vue.js. Vue.js is kind of like the mixture of Angular and React, in between those two extremes, if you want to call it like this. It's also a complete component-based UI framework, and it also includes a lot of features, but a bit less features than Angular, but more than React. It includes core features like routing, for example, and therefore with Vue, you also have to rely less on the community, and still you don't have as much overload, possibly, as you might have with Angular, depending on what you build. I also got a more detailed comparison video on these three technologies in case you're interested in that. Now, all three are super popular. React currently is probably the most popular, but all three are great. I got courses on all three, and therefore checking those out might be a good idea as well. But this course, of course, is about React, and therefore let's not lose any time. Let's dive right in. So let's get started with React, and let's dive into that React code and learn how to work with React and how to write React code. Now, in the project I showed you before, you might have noticed that I had a couple of files here in this React project, and these files are actually JavaScript files, but in those files, I then use HTML code. And that is not something you can normally do. Normally, you can't add HTML in JavaScript, at least not like this. You can add it as part of a string or of a template literal, but not just like that. That's not syntax that would work out of the box. And indeed, it wouldn't work just like this. That's why for working with React, we set up a project that's a little bit more complex than a vanilla JavaScript project. In the standard JavaScript project, I just have a HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file, and in the HTML file, I simply import those external files, and then they do their thing, because that is all just standard modern JavaScript. With React, to write React code in a convenient way, we can't just set up a project like this, because we want to use this HTML in JavaScript syntax, and the browser would not understand this syntax out of the box. That's why a React project is a bit more complex and involves more files, because it involves a so-called build step, which means the code we write will not be the code that ends up in the browser. We simply write code in a very convenient way. for us as a developer. And then behind the scenes, that code will be transformed before it reaches the browser. And in addition to that build step, with a modern React project, we typically also want a development server which hosts our running React application locally on our machine and which, for example, updates the page in the browser whenever we make changes to our code so that we don't have to reload that page manually all the time. And because that's the kind of setup we need, we don't just create a couple of HTML and JavaScript files. Instead, we typically create a React project with an extra tool that gives us all that behind-the-scenes magic added to the project automatically. And the most popular tool for that would be Create React App. You can simply Google for create-react-app, and you either find this entry on the official docs or this GitHub repository. In the end, you can use either of the two. There you learn a bit more about it and that you might not need it, but in reality, for most React projects you do. And then you learn how you can set up a project with that tool. And it's in the end just one easy command. Now, for this command to be executable on your system, though, you need to install Node.js first. Now, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime that allows you to run JavaScript outside of the browser. We don't write any Node.js code with React. React is not a Node.js library or framework. It is about browser-side JavaScript instead. But we do need Node.js to install this Create React App tool or to use this Create React App tool. And the project generated by that tool will also use Node.js behind the scenes for this automatically reloading development server and for some code transformations which transform the code we write into code that runs in the browser. That's why you should visit nodejs.org and there install the latest Node.js version, whatever that version is when you're visiting this. Simply install the latest version here by clicking on it. That will then give you an installer for your operating system. It's available for macOS, Linux, and Windows, and it should automatically select your operating system here. And then you simply walk through that installer and install Node.js. Here I'm on macOS, but the process will in the end be the same on Windows. You can just accept all the defaults, don't need to change anything there, and that will then install Node.js on your system. Now, once that is done, you are ready to run this npx create react app my app command. And for this, simply open up your default terminal or command prompt on Windows, and in there, use the cd command to navigate into a folder where you want to create your React project, your development folder, your desktop, anything like that. Then, once you're in that folder, once you navigated there inside of that terminal or command prompt, run npx create-react-app, and then simply something like my first app, or in my case, React-course. Simply hit enter thereafter, and this will now create a new folder named React course in that folder in which you ran that command. And here I need to confirm that I want to temporarily install this Create React App tool. And then this folder will be created of that name you chose here. And in that folder, a brand new React project will be set up for you. Now, React project sounds like a big thing. It will still be a simple web page with JavaScript managed through React in the end. But because of these transformations I discussed, because of that, it will be a project where all these transformation steps are already pre-configured for you, so that you can focus on the code and not on the setup of the project. Now, this can take a short while, and if you're facing any problems here, make sure you got no firewall blocking outgoing traffic or anything like that. No antivirus tool that could be interfering here. And then at some point, you should be done. You should see output that looks something like this. Now, with that, we can cd into that newly created folder, and then run npm start, which is a command based on the Node Package Manager, which is a tool that was installed together with Node.js, which will in the end execute a script that was pre-configured in that created React project. And when we run this script, a development server will be started, as it says here, which will host this React project. It should open a new tab in your browser automatically on localhost 3000 and display a starting project there, a starting website. If it didn't, simply manually go to localhost 3000 or whichever address is shown to you here. And then you should see something like this. The exact starting project can change over time, since the starting project template can be changed by the Create React App team, but ultimately you should see something like this. And that's now a little dummy website which was pre-built for us and which already exists in that starting project. Now we are going to get rid of that starting project here and build our own website though, our own React project. Now I did now open this React course folder which we created in the last step with my editor, Visual Studio Code. Now you can use any code editor you want. If you have a favorite editor already, you can stick to this. But you should use some code editor to have a better time working with React. And here I'm using Visual Studio Code, which is a great free IDE for web development. It's available for all major platforms, macOS, Windows, Linux. You can simply download it from code.visualstudio.com. And then once you download it and installed it, simply open your folder that we created in the last step, this React course folder in my case, with Visual Studio Code. Simply with File Open or Open Folder on Windows. Now once you did that, you should see something like this. Now you can tweak the settings of Visual Studio Code if you want to. If you have a different theme and you want my theme, you can go to Preferences, Color Theme. I'm using the Dark Plus theme. And it is worth noting that with Visual Studio Code, under View, you can tweak the appearance of the editor. For example, if you have a status bar at the bottom and things like that, which I disabled here. And you can go to View Extensions to install extra third-party extensions into Visual Studio Code, which can add new functionality. Now I got a bunch of extensions installed, which you don't need, but there's one extension which I do recommend, and that's the Prettier extension. You can simply search for Prettier here, and then install that extra extension. This is an extension that helps with code formatting, and which therefore helps with making your code more readable with a simple keystroke. For this, you then also want to make sure that under Preferences, Keyboard Shortcuts, if you search for Format Document, you have this shortcut bound. Because that Format Document shortcut can then use Prettier to format your code and make it more readable. For this to ensure that you use Prettier, you might want to go to your settings, to your user or project specific settings, and then there simply search for Format, and under Default Formatter, you want to select Prettier VS Code, which should be available since we installed Prettier. Now that's the setup I'm using here in the end, and with that I got an editor configured for my requirements, which we can now use to dive into that React project that was created for us and which we can now use to write some React code. So let's now as a first step clean up this project to get rid of some of the starting files and then start from scratch again to learn React in depth. Now this project which was created for us has a couple of starting files which we don't need here. For example, a file for automated tests. That is something which I cover in my complete guide course, but we don't need it here. So I'll get rid of that file and also of the logo SVG, report web vitals, setup tests, and app CSS. If you got more files, you can get rid of those as well. You should be left with an index.js, a app.js, and an index CSS file thereafter. Now in index.js, I will get rid of that import of report web vitals, and I'll explain these imports in greater detail in a second. For the moment, let's just focus on cleaning up. And I'll get rid of that code down there, and I'll get rid of that strict mode, because for the moment, for getting started, it is simpler if we just get started like this. In index.css, I'll get rid of all that code as well. We're going to add different CSS code soon. And in app.js, there I'll get rid of these two imports at the top, and then of all the content here in this return statement, all this HTML code. For the moment, we can just add a simple div here where we say hello. Now we can save that, and that's now the starting setup with which I want to get started. You also find this starting project snapshot attached to this video so that you can also download it from there and get started with that. If you do download my attached snapshot though, there's one important step you must not miss and you have to go through. You have to install third-party dependencies of that project. Because since it is a bit of a more complex project setup, working with third-party packages like the React project works a little bit differently here. We got this package.json file which lists all the dependencies of this project. And there we, for example, see the React library and another package which is part of the React library, which are listed as dependencies. Now, these dependencies are managed and installed automatically for us, and a big code bundle with our code and that third-party library code will be generated automatically behind the scenes by those build steps which exist in this project as well. Those are brought in by that React scripts package. Now, I am aware that this sounds fairly overwhelming and complex right now, especially if you never worked with anything like React before, and you're used to standard setups where you have a HTML file and a bunch of JavaScript imports, but we can't ignore all of that for the moment. We just add dependencies here, and we can then import them into our JavaScript files. That's what you see here with those strange import statements. And then this build step, which is part of this project setup, which is started when we run one of these scripts like npm start, which we did before. These scripts will then in the end combine and transform all the code and combine the third-party package code with our code and make sure that the result is an output which the browser understands. Now, because we have that setup, if you download my attachment, you need to run one extra command before everything here will work for you. And for this, it's best if you open the terminal or command prompt, which is integrated into Visual Studio Code with terminal, new terminal, which is your standard operating system terminal or command prompt, just already integrated into this IDE. And any commands we run here are then automatically executed in this project folder. And here you need to run the npm install command, which will simply download all those dependencies this project has and store them in this node modules folder, which we have here. That's a folder in which we will never work because that holds all these third-party dependencies and their dependencies which our project needs. So that's a folder which is here, but which was not part of the attached code because it's a fairly large folder, and hence the attachment would be unnecessarily big, and you can simply recreate it by running npm install in that folder that has this package.json file. So that's why we need to do that then. And thereafter, you can run npm start again to bring up that development server. And I will do that here again. And for this, I'll go to that other terminal where I ran npm start before, and I'll quit this process with Ctrl+C now. Now, as long as you don't quit that process, the development server is up and running and listening to code changes to then display them in the browser. You can quit this server whenever you're done with development for the day, and then you simply restart it with npm start again if you want to pick up development again. But now I'm not restarting it in this standalone terminal, but instead in this integrated terminal, which is already navigated into my project folder. And the advantage of starting it here is that I will always immediately see any errors that might occur if I have an error in my code, for example. And that's why I'll start it here, zoom out a bit, make this a bit smaller, and keep that up and running as long as I'm developing. So don't close the terminal, don't run Ctrl+C here, keep it up and running. And if you do that, and you go back to localhost 3000 and reload, you should just see hello there because of our cleanup process. Now that was a lot of work just to get started, but I am a big fan of having a clean start and explaining what's going on here instead of just throwing code at you and leaving it up to you to figure out what's happening. That's the project setup we're dealing with, that's my IDE, and that's the cleaned up project, which you'll also find attached. And therefore now, let's start writing our own code and let's understand these different React features and this strange syntax here step by step. Now, with the project cleaned up, let's explore React and let's write our own React code. Currently, we got two JavaScript files here, index.js and app.js. The index.js file will be the starting point of our React application. The code written in here will be the first code that will be executed in the browser when we load our project in the browser. So what we see here in the browser is the result of this code line here executing in the end. Now we don't fully understand this code line yet, but what we do in this file is we're importing a couple of things. That is how in modern JavaScript, supported by that build setup we have here, supported by that npm start script and what it does behind the scenes, how we combine multiple files and how we import features like objects or functions from file A into file B. And here we're, for example, importing the React DOM object from the React DOM library. So that's not an object we created. That is an object created by the React team exposed in that React DOM library, which is part of our project because it's part of our dependencies here. Now on that object, we call a render method. And to that render method, we pass this strange HTML code. Now this HTML in JavaScript syntax here only works because of that build step, as mentioned before, and it's actually called JSX. This kind of code is called JSX code, this HTML in JavaScript code. JSX is a special syntax which is not understood by the browser, and which therefore is converted behind the scenes, but which is more convenient for us as a developer to write, because working with React will be about building custom HTML elements, these components, and combining them together. And that is way easier if we can just write HTML code, kind of, in our JavaScript files to describe the desired output. So here we kind of create or we use our own HTML element, the app element, which is actually imported from that app file. The file extension is missing here because for JavaScript files it can be omitted. And the second argument to the render method in the end just tells React where this element should be rendered in the real DOM. Now here we're selecting an element by ID with an ID root, and we can find this on the single page that is part of this project. We find it in the public folder. There we got a couple of images, but also one HTML file. That is the single HTML file that makes up this React application. Because I mentioned before, you typically build these single page applications with React where only one HTML file is fetched from a server, and then React takes over and controls the DOM and what's visible on the screen. Now in this index.html file in the body section, we got a div with an ID root, and that ID root should look familiar. That is the div which we in the end select with this document get element by ID code snippet here. And therefore in the end what we tell React with that line is that we want to render our app HTML element, our custom HTML element, which is defined in this app.js file, into this place, into the place of this element with this root ID. So into the place of that div here in the end. That's what we're telling React. That's why if we visit our page and we inspect it, so we don't view the page source, but we inspect it with the dev tools here, when we have a look at the rendered DOM here, we see embodied that there is this div with an ID of a root, and in there we see our div with hello, which is the content we defined in app.js. And that should make sense because it is the app thing, which we import from the app.js file, which we render here. Now let's take a closer look at this app thing then. That is a function which we export to make it available outside of this file, but in the end, just a standard function, a standard JavaScript function. The only special thing about that function is that it returns such JSX code. So this HTML in JavaScript code. That's the only special thing. Other than that, it's a regular JavaScript function. And that is super important. What we have here is a so-called React component. We can use it like an HTML element, as we're doing it here in Next.js, but it's of course not an HTML element the browser would know, but one defined by us, the developers of this project. Now this component, as it's called in React's world, this custom HTML element, is in the end just a function. A function which is defined and exported, and specifically a function that returns JSX. That's important. A component, so a function that should act as a component and be usable as a component by React, must return something that can be rendered in the browser. That could be plain text, it could be a couple of other things, but it can, and most typically will be, HTML code as well, so this JSX code. And what's interesting is that in the browser, if we have a look at the DOM again, we don't see our app element anywhere here. We don't see an HTML tag called app. Instead, we just see the content of our component here, this div with hello as a text. Because these custom elements, these are not known by the browser. We just write this code in our React application, and then when it runs in the browser, React will not render these custom elements, which wouldn't tell the browser anything, but instead it will render the content returned by these custom elements. And that's how these React components work in a nutshell. That is already one very important first piece of knowledge here. That we have these React components, which are functions returning JSX, which we can use to, well, tell React, and therefore in the end the browser, what should appear on the screen. But of course, we typically don't do that with just one simple component that just returns a div of hello. Instead, I mentioned before that I want to rebuild this basic first example with this delete button, and then thereafter dive into a little bit of a more complex project in a second step. And therefore, let's now work towards that first example with that delete button and that modal overlay. Now for this first example, for this delete button, let's remove this hello text, and instead inside of this div, I'll add another div. I'll add another div, and before that div, a h1 tag where I say my to-dos, because that was also some text which we had there. And then this other div next to the h1 tag, inside of the outer div, that div will contain that single to-do, item which we have in this dummy project. For that, I'll use a h2 tag for the title. And then below that, I want to have that delete button here. Now, I'm using regular HTML elements here, because when working with JSX, you can use your own elements, your own components if you have some, but you can also use all the built-in default browser tags, like divs, paragraphs, h1 tags, buttons, inputs, and so on. So in the end here, in the component, we just write the HTML code that should eventually appear on the screen. So the output that should be rendered by the browser. So for this, we have our to-do item here and some title above it. And on that button, I'll now say delete. That was the text we had here. Now for styling purposes, we're going to add some styling soon. I'll add another div here and actually put that button inside of that div. And now I pressed this format document shortcut to auto format this code and make it a bit more readable. Now that's a more complex HTML structure. And if we now save this file and we reload, or actually we don't even need to reload because of this auto reloading built into the dev server, we should see that output here. The title, the delete button, and my to-dos. Now the delete button is not doing anything at the moment, and the title also is just static text, but we again see that we can influence what shows up in the browser with the code we define in our app component here. Now, some styling would be nice. And for this, I attached the index.css file, which you also find attached here, which contains some basic styling for this first demo. You can simply replace your index.css file with the attached one. And if you do that and reload, it looks a bit nicer. And we can also now add some CSS classes here to this code. Some CSS classes that will also influence the styling. For example, to this div, which contains the title and the nested div, I want to add a class of card. Now in regular HTML, you would do that by adding the class attribute and setting this to card, for example. Now this is not how you should do it with React. This code here looks like HTML, but it actually isn't. Behind the scenes, it is transformed to standard JavaScript. And in standard JavaScript, for one, class is a keyword, but even more important than that, if you look at vanilla JavaScript, the property name of a HTML element object for assigning or for setting the CSS classes on that object is actually class name, not class. That's just how vanilla JavaScript works. And therefore here, the attribute name actually also is class name. Now again, this can be confusing because it looks like HTML, and in standard HTML that would be class. But since this isn't HTML, since this in the end is JavaScript, just looking differently, we need to keep minor things like this in mind. Now, the good news is, however, that this is one of the very rare cases where the attribute name differs from the property name, and we have to use the property name here, and hence we don't use what we would write in standard HTML. In most cases, you can write standard HTML code here, and the class name is the most prominent special case in React, where you assign a CSS class to an element with class name as a attribute, in quotes, added to an element. But with that, if we save this again, now we have this card look of this to-do. Now there are a couple of other classes that should be added. For example, on this div, which holds the button, you should add a class name of actions. And on the button here, we add a class name of btn for button. If we do all of that, that's the look we get, and that looks a bit nicer. So now we also added some styling to our first component simply by changing the code in the index.css file and adding a couple of classes here, and therefore our first component is taking shape. However, at the moment, all that code is in one component, and there are a couple of reasons why we might want to split that up and also make our component a bit more flexible. This first code here for our to-do element exists in this app component. There's nothing wrong with it, but not only do we have some static text here, we would of course want the actual to-do title here. Not only is that the case, if we would want to add a second to-do, we would have to replicate this entire code block. And if we then ever want to change anything about that, let's say we want to add an extra span to that button, whatever, then we have to do this in all those places where we use the same code. That's not really what we want to do. That's why React embraces this concept of components, of building our own building blocks, which we then compose together. For this, I'll remove this duplicate code, and instead create a new file. A new file in that src folder, which I'll name to-do.js. The name is up to you. The extension should be .js though, and that will simply hold another component. We're going to build our second component here. Now, typically those component files, except for that so-called root component, this app component, are stored in a separate components folder, which I also added in the source folder. So I'll move to-do.js into that folder. That's not a must-do, but it is a convention to keep your project organized. Now, in this to-do.js file, I want to create my second component, that to-do component. And we did learn that a component in React is just a function. So in the end here, we define a function, to-do, and then we export that. We need to export it like this, with this syntax, to make this function available outside of this file and usable in other files. Now, one important note about this function name though, you can name your component functions however you want, but there is one important restriction, one important thing to keep in mind. The name of the function should start with a capital character. That matters because when we later use this function as a component in our HTML code, so if we use it as a custom HTML element, then it will have to start with a capital character there as well to differentiate it from the built-in HTML elements. React wants custom components to start with a capital character. So now we have our function here. And then here in this function, we must return something that can be rendered to turn this function into a component. And that something is this div here. This div with the class name card. I'll cut it from app.js and then return it here in to-do.js and press that auto format shortcut again. So now that's our to-do function returning this JSX code. Back in app.js, we can now use this to-do component. And we don't do that by executing to-do like a function, as we would normally do that, but instead we use it as a custom HTML element, just as we did it with app in the index.js file. So here, where I cut the code from, I'll add to-do like this, as a HTML element. The only special thing here is that it's self-closing. Alternatively, we write an opening and closing tag. This would work as well. But since there will be no content between the tags, we can also write a self-closing tag. But then it has to have this /. It would not be allowed like this. Now, as noted before, it is worth pointing out here that this component, this custom element, when we're using it here in this JSX code, that there it has to start with a capital character. So to-do with a lowercase t at the beginning would not be valid, because React internally differentiates between built-in HTML elements like divs and h1 tags and custom elements by casing. All these built-in elements start with a lowercase character. Custom elements built by you or others have to start with an uppercase character. And that is just something to be aware of. Now, to use to-do in app.js, though, we need to import it from the to-do.js file. And for this, at the top of this file, we import to-do from /components to construct a relative path to that components folder /to-do. Again, the file extension of .js can be omitted here. That's now this to-do imported and rendered here. If we now save all files, we see the same output as before, which is good. That means that everything still works, but we're now getting to that output with help of our separate component. Now, if we want to have multiple to-dos, we just got to replicate this to-do component here in the app component, and we now have a couple of to-dos. And if we now ever want to change anything about a to-do component, about this HTML markup that makes up a to-do, we just need to do it in the to-do.js file, like adding this span, which has no real purpose but acts as a demo. And if we then save that file, we see that extra span in all our to-dos, because we define it once and then reuse it multiple times. Just as in vanilla JavaScript, we would define a function once and then possibly call it multiple times from different places in our application. It's the same concept here with React components. Though we don't need the span here, so I will get rid of that now. What we do need here, though, is some configurability. At the moment, all to-dos just say title. And that's not too useful. These should be different to-do titles for our different to-dos. And of course, I can change the title here to Learn React, but since I do this in this to-do.js file, this will now affect all to-do usages again. So all to-dos which we're outputting. So that's not how we make this more configurable. Instead, we want to let the place where we use the to-do, so the app component, pass different data into these to-do components, just as we pass arguments into functions when we call them, to then output different data in each to-do instance depending on which data we're passing in. And that's what we're going to do now. To make our component a bit more configurable and accept different data, we in the end want to utilize a concept which we know from the function world and from standard HTML elements. In the place where we used to do, so in this app component, it would be nice if we could add an attribute like text or title, totally up to you. Let's go with text, and then set this to some value, like learn React on the first to-do, then master React on the second to-do, and let's say explore the full React course in the third to-do. Now it would be nice if we could do that, but if I add this here in app.js and save it, this has no effect on what we see on the screen. The reason for this is that we're setting these custom attributes, but in the to-do.js file, we have no code that would pick up those values. Nonetheless, this is how you do pass data into a component. We just also need to write some code in the component to then accept and use those received values. And we do that with a concept called props. We accept a parameter in our function component, and in every function component, we can accept that parameter. And that parameter is typically called props. You can name it whatever you want, since it's your code, but it's called props because this React concept is called props. This will be an object, props will be a JavaScript object, where all the attributes added on the element are in the end available as key value pairs in this props object. So here, these attribute names will be the keys, and the values will be, well, the values. So props inside of the to-do component will be an object now that has a text property and then different values for this text property. And if you named this attribute differently, that's also okay. You will then have a property of that name in your props object. So therefore now here in this h2 tag, we want to output this text we're getting on this props object. Now in standard JavaScript, we access object properties with the dot notation. So we could output props.text here to access the text property in the props object and therefore the value stored in this property. But if we do this here, we just see props.text as our output. The reason for this is that everything here in this JSX block is treated as HTML elements or plain text. The good news, however, is that we can also output dynamic expressions as part of the JSX code. We can tell React that something should not be treated as plain text, but instead as a JavaScript expression that should be evaluated. And we do this with a special syntax inside of this JSX code, which looks like this. Opening and closing curly braces, single curly braces. And between those braces, you can have any JavaScript expression you want, like for example 2 plus 2. Now this will not be treated as plain text, but instead it will be executed as JavaScript. So if I save this, we see 4, the result of this expression. Now you can have any single line expression in here, but you can't have any block statements here. So adding an if check here would not work. But what does work is referring to props.text here. So simply outputting the result of accessing this text property on the props object. If we add this code and save this, we see our different texts here for the different to-dos. And now we build our own truly reusable React component here, the to-do component. It is truly reusable because now it does not just have some hard-coded structure and text inside of it, but also some dynamic code using this core concept built into React, the props concept, for accepting data from outside, so from the place where it is being rendered. That is a key concept, this props concept, and that is how you build reusable custom elements, reusable components. And that's therefore a major first step here. Now let's make sure that we handle events, that we handle a click on the delete button, and that we then also change something on the screen when the button is clicked. To be precise, that we present this nice overlay when that delete button is clicked.